Everyone knows religion is supposed to make us better people. It's supposed to teach us love, humility, forgiveness. From Sunday school lessons to morning prayers in classrooms, we've been told again and again that faith shapes us into moral, compassionate human beings, that without it, we'd lose our way. And to be fair, psychologists, sociologists, even neuroscientists have studied religion's impact for decades. They've documented how belief can build community, how rituals can create belonging, how sacred traditions can give people a sense of meaning. On the surface, the idea seems simple. Religion is the foundation of morality itself. But when you look a little closer, something disturbing happens. The very systems we're told were built to heal us may actually be teaching us to hate ourselves. Beneath the hymns, the rituals, the sacred texts, there's a psychological pattern at work, a blueprint designed to keep you small, to keep you ashamed, to keep you dependent. And now, science is exposing exactly how it works. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden mechanisms religion uses to implant self-loathing, from guilt conditioning to fear-based obedience, to the way doctrines slowly rewrite how you see yourself. By the end, you'll see why what you thought was sacred guidance may actually be the oldest psychological trap in human history. If you've ever felt religion left scars on your mind, hit subscribe. You're about to see why you were never the problem. But here's the thing. Guilt and shame aren't just side effects of religion. They're not accidental byproducts of ancient rituals. They're the very tools built into the system, woven into the fabric of doctrine itself. Think about it. Every sermon, every confession, every reminder of sin is doing more than teaching morality. It's creating a cycle of self-surveillance, a constant internal voice whispering, "You are flawed, you are broken, you need saving." And once that seed is planted, it doesn't just stay in the background. It becomes the lens through which you see yourself. That's why so many people raised in strict religious environments carry lifelong feelings of inadequacy, shame, or unworthiness, even long after leaving the faith. Psychologists call this internalized control. You don't need someone standing over you with rules, because you've been programmed to monitor yourself. And that's exactly where we need to start our journey. Because if religion is supposed to free us, why does it so often leave people feeling chained to guilt? If faith is meant to bring peace, why is suffering treated as proof of devotion? These aren't abstract questions. They cut to the core of how billions of people experience their identity every single day. And when we follow the evidence, the picture becomes even more unsettling. This isn't just about rituals or traditions. It's about how entire systems of belief have been engineered, whether consciously or not, to keep people in a state of self-doubt. And guilt is only the first layer. Because once guilt takes root, it transforms into something even more destructive: shame. The kind of shame that doesn't just tell you, "I did something wrong." It convinces you, "I am something wrong." And that is where the real programming begins. If religion was truly designed to liberate us, why is guilt its most common currency? Think about it. At the heart of nearly every faith tradition is the reminder that you are guilty. Guilty of sin. Guilty of imperfection. Guilty simply for being human. And this guilt isn't treated as a passing feeling. It's a permanent state. Psychologists call this conditioning. The more you're reminded of your flaws, the more your brain begins to anticipate punishment, even when none is coming. It's the same process that keeps lab animals pressing levers to avoid shocks, long after the shocks have stopped. In religion, guilt becomes the lever you can never stop pressing. Take Catholicism, for example. The ritual of confession doesn't just ask believers to admit specific wrongdoings. It reinforces the idea that guilt is a constant companion, and that forgiveness must be endlessly sought through authority figures. In Protestant traditions, especially those shaped by Calvinist theology, you'll hear about total depravity, the belief that human beings are utterly corrupt by nature. Imagine what that does to a child who grows up hearing it. Every thought, every desire, every instinct, corrupt. The message is clear. You don't just make mistakes, you are a mistake. And in Islam, while the concept of fitra teaches that humans are born pure, that purity is said to be constantly corrupted by sin and disobedience. The burden of guilt becomes a lifelong struggle against your own impulses. Different doctrines, different rituals, but the same underlying message: guilt is unavoidable. And when you hear it enough times, guilt stops being something you feel. It becomes something you are. Now here's where it gets interesting. Research in psychology and mental health has shown that religious guilt isn't harmless. In fact, studies consistently link high levels of religious guilt to anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive patterns. One study in the Journal of Psychology and Theology found that excessive guilt tied to religious teachings was strongly associated with feelings of unworthiness and chronic mental distress. This isn't just about belief, it's about biology. Because guilt activates the brain's threat detection systems. Every reminder of sin lights up the same circuits we use when facing danger. Over time, your brain learns to treat yourself as the danger. And that's when guilt transforms into something far more powerful: self-surveillance. Imagine a prison where there are no guards, just a tower in the middle. Prisoners can't tell when they're being watched, so they begin to watch themselves. That's the panopticon, a model designed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And religious guilt works in the exact same way. You don't need a priest, pastor, or imam standing over your shoulder 24/7. You've already internalized the voice of authority. You've already become your own warden. And the cruel genius of this system is that it doesn't require constant enforcement. You enforce it on yourself. Every thought, every action, every private moment. You carry the prison inside your own mind. And here's the part most people never realize. Guilt isn't where it ends. Because once guilt is embedded deeply enough, it doesn't just whisper, "You did something wrong." It begins to scream, "You are something wrong." That shift from guilt to shame is where the real programming begins. And it changes everything about how you see yourself. So here's the shift. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am something wrong." And when religion moves you from guilt into shame, it's no longer about your actions. It's about your very identity. Take the Christian doctrine of original sin. The claim that from the moment you're born, you're already broken. Before you've spoken a word, before you've made a single choice, you carry the stain of sin. That's not about what you've done. That's about who you are. And think about the psychological weight of that. Children grow up believing their very existence is flawed, that they owe their lives not as a gift, but as a debt they can never fully repay. This is where guilt transforms into something far more corrosive, because guilt can, at least in theory, be resolved. You confess, you repent, you seek forgiveness. Shame, on the other hand, is sticky. Shame clings to your sense of self. It whispers that no matter what you do, it will never be enough. Psychologists make an important distinction here. In guilt-based cultures, the focus is on behavior. You broke the rule, now make it right. But in shame-based cultures, the focus is on identity. You are defective. And religion often blends the two, creating a system where guilt feeds directly into shame until your very sense of self is under siege. And here's the catch. Shame doesn't just hurt, it makes you dependent. Because when you believe you are fundamentally flawed, you become desperate for someone or something to tell you that you're worthy. And where do you turn? Right back to the very authority that planted the shame in the first place. That's the cycle. Religion teaches you that you are broken. Religion convinces you that only it can fix you. And then religion positions itself as the eternal gatekeeper of your worth. In Catholicism, this means a priest absolving you after confession. In Protestant traditions, it's the preacher reminding you that only Christ's sacrifice makes you valuable. In Islam, it's constant reminders of obedience as the only path back to purity. Different languages, different rituals, same underlying pattern, shame that keeps you tethered to authority. And what's most insidious is how this seeps into the deepest layers of identity. Shame doesn't just control your behavior, it rewires how you see yourself. It tells you, you're not trustworthy, you're not good enough. You need someone else, always, to validate your worth. And once that belief is embedded, it doesn't take chains or guards to keep you in line. You'll police yourself. You'll hand over your freedom willingly because you've been convinced you're not worthy of it on your own. That's not morality. That's psychological engineering. And this is where religion's most brilliant and most sinister design reveals itself. Because once you've been taught to see yourself as broken, you'll do almost anything for a cure. And that's exactly where obedience comes in. Psychologists have long studied why people follow authority, even when it leads to harm. The most famous example? The Milgram experiment. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram asked participants to deliver electric shocks to another person whenever they gave the wrong answer. What the volunteers didn't know was that the shocks weren't real. The other person was an actor. But to the subjects, the screams of pain sounded terrifyingly real. And here's the shocking part. More than 60% of participants continued delivering shocks all the way to the maximum level, simply because an authority figure told them to. Now think about that. Ordinary people, teachers, parents, office workers, were willing to cause extreme suffering, not because they wanted to, but because they believed obedience was the right thing to do. A few years later, the Stanford prison experiment showed something similar. Volunteers randomly assigned as guards began to abuse those labeled as prisoners. Why? Because the structure of authority gave them permission. The roles themselves became the justification. Both studies reveal the same disturbing truth. When guilt and authority mix, obedience becomes automatic. Now map this back onto religion. If you already believe you're guilty, If shame has convinced you that you are fundamentally flawed, then the authority figure standing at the pulpit, or behind the confessional, or at the front of the mosque, isn't just a leader. They become the lifeline to your worth. The priest who grants absolution, the pastor who interprets scripture, the imam who defines obedience, the guru who demands surrender. Each one stands in the place of ultimate authority. And when they say, "This is what God wants," how easy is it to disobey? When you've been told that your eternal fate is on the line? This is where fear magnifies everything. Because it's not just the fear of disappointing your community, it's the fear of eternal punishment, the fear of hellfire, the fear that even questioning the command could lead to infinite suffering. In psychological terms, this creates an obedience loop. Guilt primes you for compliance. Authority directs your actions. Fear locks the system in place. And once the loop is established, it doesn't need constant force. It runs almost automatically. And it works because the stakes religion sets aren't temporary. They're absolute. A parent can ground you. A boss can fire you. But a God can condemn you forever. That kind of fear doesn't just encourage obedience, it demands it. And here's the part that makes it even more powerful. The system disguises obedience as love. You're not just following rules, you're proving devotion. You're not just obeying authority, you're honoring God. What looks like submission feels like holiness. And yet, when stripped of its sacred language, the mechanics are identical to what Milgram and Zimbardo revealed. Ordinary people following authority out of guilt, fear, and the belief that they have no other choice. But this programming doesn't just shape your behavior in the moment. It goes deeper, much deeper. Because when obedience is tied to your worth, when every thought and action feels like it's being monitored by an ultimate authority, your brain itself begins to change. And science shows this programming isn't just emotional. It rewires your mind on a neurological level. What begins as belief literally reshapes your biology. This isn't just metaphor, it's neuroscience. When you grow up hearing that you're sinful, broken, or unworthy, your brain doesn't simply store those ideas as abstract thoughts. It wires them in. Every sermon about sin, every warning about hell, every moment of guilt or shame activates very specific neural circuits. Those responsible for fear, for pain, and for self-criticism. And here's where it gets unsettling. The brain doesn't distinguish much between a real physical threat and a perceived spiritual one. When a preacher says, "Your soul is in danger," your amygdala, the brain's fear center, lights up just as if a predator was chasing you. Over time, this repeated activation leaves a mark. Through neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, fear and guilt become stronger and easier to trigger. The grooves get deeper. The pathways get faster, until eventually, self-loathing isn't just a thought you have, it's a reflex you live with. Psychologists studying religious trauma call this toxic guilt. It's not just about what you've done, it's about how your brain has been conditioned to see you as the problem. And because the system frames this as spiritual growth or holy conviction, it's rarely questioned. But here's the fascinating part. Other practices show the exact opposite effect. Studies on meditation and secular compassion training, where the focus is on self-kindness and acceptance, activate completely different regions of the brain. Instead of fear circuits firing, It's the prefrontal cortex and areas linked to empathy and positive emotion. The result? Greater self-worth, reduced anxiety, and a healthier sense of identity. In other words, while religion often wires the brain for fear and self-condemnation, compassion-based practices wire the brain for resilience and self-acceptance. And this isn't just theory. In one study published in Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience, researchers found that participants practicing loving-kindness meditation showed measurable increases in gray matter in brain regions tied to empathy and emotional regulation. Compare that to repeated fear-based sermons, which strengthen the circuits of threat detection and self-criticism. Two pathways, two outcomes. One keeps you trapped in cycles of fear and self-doubt. The other builds confidence and compassion. And yet, for centuries, billions have been taught to choose the first path. Not because it was healthier, not because it was liberating, but because it reinforced obedience. This is what makes religious programming so powerful. It doesn't just shape beliefs, it shapes biology. It carves itself into the very structure of your brain. And once those pathways are formed, they're hard to undo, which is why people who leave strict religious traditions often describe years of lingering fear, shame, or even nightmares about hell, even if they no longer believe in it consciously. The circuits were wired too deeply, and still, the system is normalized. It's treated as sacred, unquestionable, even divine. But here's the real question. If this programming is so destructive, why was it designed this way in the first place? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the truth is, these patterns of guilt and shame didn't just emerge by accident. They were shaped, codified, and reinforced by some of the most powerful religious institutions in history. Take Augustine in the 4th century. He wasn't just another church leader. He was the one who fully developed the doctrine of original sin. According to Augustine, humanity wasn't just occasionally sinful. It was inherently corrupt. Every person, from the moment of birth, carried the stain of Adam's fall. Now imagine what that did for the church's authority. If people are permanently broken, then salvation isn't just helpful, it's essential. And the church positioned itself as the exclusive supplier of that salvation. Fast forward to the medieval period. The penance system turned guilt into a kind of currency. Confession, prayers, fasting, pilgrimages, all framed as ways to pay off your debt of sin. At its height, this even morphed into the selling of indulgences. You could literally buy your way out of punishment. What looks like a spiritual practice was, in reality, a remarkably effective system of control. And the pattern continued. In 17th century Puritan communities, moral codes weren't just encouraged. They were enforced through constant surveillance, neighbors watching neighbors, families policing each other's behavior. Every failure to conform wasn't simply breaking a rule, it was evidence of your fallen nature. And again, the only path back to worthiness was through obedience to religious authority. What all these examples share is the same underlying mechanism. Take natural human imperfection, frame it as evidence of deep moral failure, and then offer religion as the cure. It's guilt and shame transformed into social engineering. Sociologists like Emil Durkheim recognized this. He argued that religion often functions less as a set of beliefs about God, and more as a system that binds communities together by regulating behavior. Michel Foucault went even further, pointing out how power operates most effectively when people internalize it when they begin to police themselves without needing constant external enforcement. And that's exactly what these doctrines achieved. Augustine gave people a permanent sense of sin. The medieval church turned that into a cycle of penance. The Puritans turned everyday life into a stage for moral judgment. Across centuries, guilt and shame weren't just preached, they were institutionalized. And here's what makes it brilliant, though sinister. These systems didn't rely on brute force. They didn't need soldiers or constant punishment. Instead, they created invisible prisons of the mind. People carried their guilt with them. They lived under constant self-surveillance. And in doing so, they became their own wardens. This wasn't just about shaping individuals. Over time, this programming spread so deeply that it molded entire cultures, governments, and social systems. From laws to education to family structures, the logic of guilt and shame seeped into the very foundations of society. And that's the most shocking part, because this programming didn't just shape individuals, it shaped entire civilizations. And that programming didn't stay in the past. It's alive right now. Look around, and you'll see the echoes everywhere. Take purity culture, for example. In many conservative communities, a person's worth, especially women's, is tied directly to their sexual purity. The message is simple. If you break the rule, you're not just guilty of an act, you are dirty. Shame as identity, alive and well. Or think about body shame. Generations have been taught that their bodies are sources of sin, that desire itself is dangerous. Even something as natural as attraction gets framed as proof of moral weakness. And for LGBTQ+ people, the weight is even heavier. Countless stories reveal how doctrines of sin create lifetimes of guilt, driving many into silence, secrecy, or despair. One study by the Journal of Homosexuality found that LGBTQ+ individuals raised in highly religious homes were significantly more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts compared to their secular peers. But it doesn't stop there. Broader research shows that, on average, people in highly dogmatic religious environments report lower levels of self-esteem and higher levels of anxiety than those raised without strict religious frameworks. The very system that promises peace and healing often leaves scars that take decades to undo. And what's worse is how these patterns recycle themselves. Parents pass guilt down to children, not out of cruelty, but because it was handed to them the same way. Communities enforce silence, not always out of malice, but out of fear of punishment themselves. The cycle goes on. Guilt becomes shame. Shame becomes obedience. Obedience reinforces authority. And the trauma quietly spreads across families, generations, and entire cultures. And yet, most people never recognize it for what it is. Because when a system of control is disguised as love, when it's framed as moral guidance, questioning it feels like betrayal. That's why so many people stay silent. That's why the scars are so hard to trace back to their source. But here's the thing. Once you know the mechanics, once you see the blueprint, you can never see it the same way again. Because suddenly, the voice that says you're not enough stops sounding like truth and starts sounding like programming. And when you recognize the code, you realize something powerful. It can be broken. But here's the twist. Once you see the code, you can start to break it. Because the first step to freedom is recognizing the trap. Once you understand how guilt and shame have been woven into the very structure of belief, you can start to see them for what they are, not eternal truths, but systems of control. And here's the empowering part. What has been learned can be unlearned. When you catch that voice inside saying, "I am unworthy," you can start to ask, where did that voice come from? Was it really yours? Or was it planted there by centuries of doctrine designed to keep you small? This recognition alone shifts the balance of power, because once you see the mechanism, it loses its magic. It goes from being wholly truth to being just another form of conditioning. So what replaces it? This is where alternative frameworks come in. Secular compassion practices, for example, encourage you to see yourself not as broken, but as human. Humanist ethics remind us that morality doesn't come from fear of punishment. It comes from empathy, reason, and our shared humanity. And cognitive science is clear. The stories you tell yourself about who you are shape your brain just as powerfully as sermons ever did. Repeated self-kindness builds new neural pathways. Acts of compassion strengthen circuits of empathy and resilience. In other words, just as you were once programmed for self-loathing, you can consciously reprogram yourself for self-worth. And here's the truth most religions would never want you to hear. You were never broken to begin with. You were only taught to believe you were. The chains of guilt and shame were never divine. They were psychological tools. And once you see them clearly, you can decide, for the first time, whether to keep carrying them or to finally put them down. Religion didn't just fail to save you. It taught you to despise yourself. And knowing that is the beginning of freedom. If this opened your eyes, share it. Because breaking this programming starts with awareness.